Welcome again. This is lecture 6, and we are going to discuss the question of how do we come to understand ourselves, the strategy of inferring the causes of emotions, thinking, and behavior. The purpose of this lecture is to discuss research on the theory of self-attribution, the cognitive strategies we use to find out, to understand how do we feel, think, and act the way we do. The basic principle of self-attribution theory is the assumption that we really do not have direct access, immediate knowledge of our own internal processes. Of course, in everyday life, we go on the assumption that our knowledge of ourselves is unquestionable, immediate, direct, and privileged. Self-attribution theory makes a contrary claim. It is argued that our self-knowledge is also based on inferential processes, observing and interpreting what goes on, rather than some kind of a direct privileged access to our internal processes. So self-attribution deals with three major domains of our internal life: how we explain our emotions, how do we explain cognition, and how do we make sense of our own behaviors. Uh, First, we're going to look at the question of how emotions are understood. How do we know what it is that we actually feel? There is a dominant inferential theory of emotional understanding put together by Schachter, who argued that emotional experience is fundamentally the result of a two-step self-perception, self-attributional process in which people first experience physiological arousal, which in itself is not meaningful, and then they seek an appropriate cognitive explanation for the arousal that they experience. Uh, this two-factor theory of emotion, two factors because it involves arousal plus cognitive labeling, was demonstrated in a famous experiment by Schachter and Singer in 1962, in which participants were given an injection that was either epinephrine, similar to adrenaline, that causes arousal, and they were either told that the injection will make them aroused, or they were told that there will be no arousal effects, that is an innocuous injection. So you have two groups of people, half of them feel aroused and know why, and the other half feel aroused and they don't know why. What Schachter and Singer found in 1962 is that when you ask people in these two groups to sit down in a waiting room while they're waiting for the experiment, and the experimenter put in a confederate, another student who was apparently waiting for the experiment, and this student behaved in either a very happy, euphoric, positive, jocular way, or behaved in an angry, unpleasant, negative way. But Schachter and Singer were wondering, will the behavior of the confederate influence the kind of emotional response reported by the genuine participant? They found that in the condition when the participant did not know that they received an arousal-inducing drug, in other words, they experienced unexplained arousal, they were significantly more influenced by the behavior of the confederate. In other words, they came to label their arousal as an emotion, taking their cues from the behavior of the confederate. The subjects who were informed of the arousing properties of the injection were not influenced that much by the behavior of the confederate. So in other words, what's happened is that the epinephrine ignorant group misattributed their arousal as consistent with the emotional cues they received from the confederate. In other words, what the two-factor model really predicts is that emotion is a function of two components, an arousal and a cognitive label. As this cartoon shows, you might experience arousal, feeling warm, your hands are a little shaky, your heart is thumping, but we don't know what this arousal means. We'll interpret it depending on the situation we find ourselves in. If you find a scary bear, you call it fear. If you find an incredibly attractive person, you might call it romantic love. Uh, if you are at the exam, then you will interpret it as anxiety and so on. So the same arousal gets emotional meaning only after it is cognitively labeled and interpreted. Uh, this misattribution of arousal principle can produce some strange consequences. If we don't always know directly the source of our emotional state, then non-specific arousal can be attributed to or explained to a completely different source. For example, as the cartoon illustrates, roller coasters and scary movies make a great first date material because the arousal can be misinterpreted by your partner as indicating some kind of a positive emotional response to your partner. The principle that arousal can be misinterpreted is nicely demonstrated in an experiment by Aaron and Dutton in 1974. They used an ingenious technique to manipulate arousal. They asked their participants to either walk through a swaying suspension bridge, the one you see in the picture, which of course does cause people to experience arousal, or in the control condition, they were asked to walk through a stable concrete bridge. And as they were walking through the bridge, they encountered an attractive female who introduced herself as carrying out a research project. And among other things, she asked them to complete a thematic apperception test. This is the test when you have to describe what you see in ink blots, and also gave them her phone number so she can be called if they have any questions about the study. So you have a manipulation when you have either arousal on the suspension bridge or no arousal, and then you meet an attractive person. The prediction is that the arousal caused by the bridge would influence the way people responded to the experimenter, the attractive female. The results confirmed these predictions. It turned out that there was significantly more sexual imagery on the TA test after participants walked through the arousing bridge, and they were also more likely to contact the attractive experimenter when she was encountered in an aroused condition on the suspension bridge. And the reason for that is that the arousal was presumably misattributed as indicating attraction. You can see the results on the left-hand side. People are much more likely to contact the attractive female interviewer after the arousing bridge than the control bridge, but when they meet a male interviewer, there is no effect at all. So that emotional theory predicts that we often find the wrong cause for our attributed emotional states and come up with an incorrect explanation. Often the residual source of arousal from one source, for example, caffeine, exercise, or a fright, can enhance the intensity of how we interpret our emotional reactions depending on what's going on in our situation. Sometimes this sort of emotional misattribution can produce some very surprising and unexpected effects. It turns out that even arousal can be misattributed if you get incorrect signals. We can use emotional misattribution sometimes even in a therapeutic way by misinterpreting arousal in a less challenging way. For example, insomnia can be cured. I'm going to describe that study to you next. And there are ways in which arousal can then inform other kinds of emotional reactions. So one interesting study reported by Valins looked at how fake heart rate indicating arousal that in fact doesn't correspond to reality can also be misinterpreted. In that study, male participants were given false feedback about their heart rates while they were looking at images of sexy Playboy pinup girls. The researchers at the same time put a headphone and gave them what they believed to be feedback about their heart rate. But in fact, the heart rate was manipulated. It was arbitrarily made to beat faster at certain images than at other images. So the feedback about the heart rate was fake. Then participants had to rate the images that they saw. And the findings showed that when they heard an increased heart rate, even if it wasn't true, those pictures were preferred significantly more to pictures when the heart rate remained steady. Furthermore, the participants were given an option to take home some of the images, and once again, they significantly preferred the images when they believed their heart rate to be accelerated. So what this study shows that even in the absence of real arousal, because you only had fake arousal indicated by the feedback of the heart rate, that can be misinterpreted as indicating interest in a particular sexually attractive picture. The message is kind of surprising. What it really says is that we don't really know what we like until we have a chance to inspect some information. For example, the heart rate that we hear on our headphones. The misattribution of arousal principle can also have some interesting applied applications. For example, Storm and Nisbet recruited 42 insomniacs at Yale University, and they were all given a placebo pill that had no actual effect. But they were given two different kinds of information. In one condition, they were told that the pill is arousing. This drug will increase your heart rate and body temperature, and you may feel like your mind is racing. In the other condition, the other group was told that this is a relaxing drug. It will lower your heart rate and body temperature, and it will calm your mind. The real question was, which of the two groups found it easier to fall asleep? Which of the two conditions provided a better cure for insomnia? And what Storms and Nisbet found is a surprising finding. Those participants who expected the drug to make them aroused actually fell asleep faster. Why? Because they misattributed their aroused state to the drug and not to the usual anxiety that kept them awake otherwise. So in other words, simply by providing an alternative attributional target for their arousal, the real source of the arousal becomes less strong and they are better able to go to sleep. The point is that what we experience is always subject to the interpretations, the self-attributions that we employ, and if we find a way of manipulating the self-attribution, it can be helpful in eliminating otherwise bothersome clinical symptoms, including insomnia. In the second topic that we are going to look at in self-attribution is the attribution of cognition. This is the question of how do we know what we think. We're going to look at research that evaluates how much access we have to our internal mental processes, how much we really know what we want to do, and also psychological reactance, the research that shows that people often don't know what they value until after it is lost or threatened. One of the classic experiments in the self-attribution of cognition is a study by Nisbet and Wilson. It's actually entitled Telling More Than We Can Know, demonstrating how people have no direct access into their own cognitive processes. In that experiment, subjects were asked to judge the quality of 4 different stockings. They set up a table outside the bargain store with a sign that read Consumer Evaluation Survey, which is the best quality. In fact, all 4 stockings were totally identical. There was no difference between them. In that situation, most of the judges chose the last one, stocking D, 40%, and the fewest people, 12%, preferred the first stocking, A. And yet, when Nisbet and Wilson asked the participants to give an explanation of why they preferred D, they reported a completely incorrect confabulated answer. They said things like it had a better quality, it had a greater elasticity. In other words, they made up completely artificial stories justifying their choice. Nisbet and Wilson argues that studies like these demonstrate that people have no direct access into their own judgmental processes. We don't know why we make the choice we make. And if we are asked to give an explanation, we make up a story that sounds plausible. In fact, observers who didn't participate in the choice, when asked to explain why a person would choose that particular stocking, gave very similar stories to the participants. The point is that we did not know, the participants did not know what went on inside their heads, and they gave an explanation that just seemed plausible and acceptable in the circumstances. So we oftentimes do not know why our cognition works we do. And in addition to that, research on psychological reactance suggests that we often also do not really know how much we value particular things, people, and situations. Research on psychological reactance shows that when people are prohibited from performing an action, that loss of freedom produces a reactance. Their value of the prohibited object or activity significantly increases. They are more likely to want to perform a prohibited action. This was experimentally demonstrated in an interesting study by Pennebaker and Sanders in 1976, who put a sign in the bathroom which read either "Do not write on these walls under any circumstances," or the sign just read "Please do not write on these walls." So one sign is a prohibiting sign, don't do it under any circumstances. The other one is a request. The question is, how would these 2 signs influence the frequency of graffiti? Pennebaker and Sanders found that there was significantly more graffiti in the first condition, when people felt that their freedom has been taken away to do something that they might not actually have wanted to do in the first place. The point is that we tend to overvalue lost opportunities because we don't really know how much we value something until we are about to lose it. Too much pressure or prohibition or prevention tends to produce paradoxical effects of overvaluing something that we may not have valued much before. Again, the point is that we often don't know what is important to us until it is endangered. Much research on self-attribution shows that we have very limited cognitive access and control to our own internal mental processes. It turns out that actors, the people who make the choice about the stockings, are no better in explaining their actions than observers who make the same explanations. It suggests that we do not have a direct access to our own internal mental processes. In any case, What would such effective introspection involve? At what point in the judgmental decision-making process should we be able to interfere and give a correct account of what's really going on in our minds? Then Wagner, a social psychologist at Harvard, argued that we are practically unable to detect or to think about our real causes of our behaviors. In a series of experiments, he showed that when people are asked to suppress a thought, to get rid of a particular idea, they are not only not able to do it, but it's likely to intrude into their thoughts even more. In a famous series of experiments, participants were instructed not to think about white bears while they were performing a task. What Wagner found was that those who were told not to think of a white bear thought about it far more than the participants who did not receive that instruction. So we are not really lords in our own house. Not only can we not report on our mental processes, but we are also very poor in suppressing unwanted thoughts. Many psychological disorders occur because people ruminate. They think incessantly about topics that make them unhappy, and yet they cannot really do very much about it. The point is that most of our thinking, most of our reaction, most of our social behaviors actually may occur automatically on autopilot, and we do not have very much advanced knowledge or ability to influence many reactions. Next, we are going to briefly discuss the self-attribution of behavior. How do we explain and make sense of the causes of our behavior and our motivations in performing it? The question is really, why am I doing this? And self-attribution research suggests that very often we just don't know. We're going to look at different experimental topics on extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, self-handicapping, and learned helplessness. The fundamental question in self-attributing behavior is again a distinction between internal and external causes. External causes occur when we find extrinsic motivation for our behavior, when we engage in an activity because there are external demands, causes, pressures to do it. Intrinsic motivation is attributed when we perform an activity because we enjoy it or find it interesting, and not because there is any external reward or pressure to perform it. Now, the idea then with self-attribution of behavior and motivation, that we know ourselves by observing our own behavior. Daryl Bem proposed something called self-perception theory that formalizes the idea that when our attitudes and feelings are uncertain or ambiguous or difficult to explain, we infer these states by observing our own behavior and the situation in which it occurs, and we make some inferential guesses about why we are doing it. That can be really important in explaining why people sometimes do or do not do particular things. Whether you explain your behavior as due to extrinsic reward or intrinsic motivation has consequences for the likelihood that you will want to continue doing it. Imagine the following situation. Let's say you like gardening and you go out to the nature strip in front of your house and you plant some plants and you water them and you look after them. You do it because you really enjoy doing it. This is when you do something for intrinsic reasons and there is no extrinsic reward. It's the top panel of the figure on this slide. You perform an activity for its own sake. There is no extrinsic reward. And so your perception, your explanation for your behavior is I'm doing this simply because I'm enjoying it. And that maintains your perception of intrinsic motivation. Now imagine the following. The local council decides to give money to people for looking after the nature strip. You introduce an extrinsic reward to encourage a behavior that people would be happy to do anyway. What happens now? If you look at the bottom panel of the slide, you perform an activity for its own sake, but now you get a reward for it. Now you get money. That will change your self-perception. You will now say, I'm doing this because I'm rewarded, because I'm being paid. That means that your intrinsic motivation will be reduced. And when the external reward is taken away, you will no longer do the activity. Another everyday example is blood donation. Lots of people donate blood because they want it. In some countries, they give you money for blood donation. Once you receive money, people will no longer do it out of their own intrinsic motivation. There's a range of experiments showing that when people get rewards for activities they would do anyway, once the reward is taken away, the behavior tends to also dissipate. Often people employ fairly complex, motivated mental gymnastics to create situations in which they can avoid self-blame. That is the paradox of self-handicapping. Self-handicapping occurs when, in order to protect our self-image and positive identity, we try to create excuses for the likelihood of failing at a particular task. For example, somebody might say to themselves, I didn't get rejected for the job because I'm unqualified. It was because I stayed up too late partying the night before the interview. The reason why people engage in those sorts of strategies is because it's more self-deflating to try hard and fail than it is to procrastinate or handicap yourself, but have an handy excuse for the failure. For example, if you know in advance that you are not very good in a particular course and you are likely to do badly at the exam, you might choose to stay up late and get drunk the night before, because this way you can make an external attribution for your failure. I got plastered and I didn't prepare, rather than have to face the fact that you are either lack the ability or you didn't make an effort. This principle was nicely demonstrated in a study by Forgas and Jones, who had participants perform a task, and some of them were led to believe that they are performing badly, and others were led to believe that they are likely to do really well. And they were told that they're going to have a second session doing a similar task. So half the people expect to be successful, and the other half expect to fail. After that, Forgas and Jones asked their participants, allegedly as part of a completely different experiment, to volunteer to take a drug that is described as either facilitating performance or handicapping performance, inhibiting performance. Now the question is, would you choose to take a handicapping drug when you expect to fail, which would seem ridiculous, or would you be more likely to do it when you are confident and you expect to success? As you can see in the figure, what happened is that people who expected to succeed were more likely to take the helpful drug because they were confident that they will do well. People who were expecting to fail were significantly more likely to take a handicapping drug. And the only explanation for that is that by taking a handicapping drug, they created an alternative external explanation for their expected failure. So the strategy is, when I don't think I'm going to do well, I'm going to try hard to find some external cause to blame my failure on. So self-serving bias, boys, work this way. We attribute our successes to ability and effort, and failures to luck and things external. We tend to compare ourselves favorably to other people. There is often an unrealistic optimism. We tend to see the world in more optimistic terms than reality would justify. We often tend to overestimate the tendency that our attitudes and opinions are shared by other people. The tendency to see ourselves as better than average is well illustrated in the study by Brown, published in 2012 on the left-hand side of your figure. In this study, participants were asked to indicate how relevant and how accurate were highly positive traits, highly important traits, and less important traits to describing themselves. So important traits would be like honest, kind, intelligent, and less important traits might be like imaginative and outgoing. And as you can see, there is a significant tendency in perceiving highly important traits to be especially descriptive of yourself compared to others, more so than low important traits. A typical example of the I am better than average attributional distortion. Now, such positive self-illusions can be adaptive because sometimes they might promote coping and engagement. The social psychologists von Hippel and Chivers also argued that self-deception has another less obvious benefit. It makes it easier to deceive others about ourselves. As Seinfeld said in one of the TV episodes, it is not a lie if you believe it. If you convince yourself of your particular qualities, then you might be more effective in persuading others that they are true. There are a couple of downsides with positive biases as well. Clinical research shows that people who are depressed are more accurate than people who are not depressed, the so-called depressive realism phenomenon. So depressed people curiously see themselves more accurately and objectively than the non-depressed. Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist, also argued that the enhancement of self-esteem without real basis can also be a negative educational objective. When people expect to have positive outcomes because their self-esteem is continuously boosted in school, the real world, the life, will not necessarily support those expectations and they might end up disappointed. The extent to which our positive self-esteem is important also differs across cultures. Individualistic Western liberal cultures typically value self-enhancement, but more collectivistic communal cultures tend to place more emphasis on group enhancement. So just to overview self-serving attributions, we tend to make self-serving attributions because we try to maintain a positive self-esteem and dignity whenever possible, even if that means distorting reality by changing a thought or a belief. We also want people to think well of us and admire us as much as possible. So telling other people that our poor performance was due to some external cause allows us to save face vis-à-vis others. As we have seen, the majority of people think that they are above average on most desirable characteristics. In one interesting study, men and women were asked a simple question of how many sex partners did you have? Well, of course, on average, the two numbers should be the same. But what the results showed is that men claim to have 20 sex partners and women only 66. The explanation for that is obviously that men tend to overstate their relative success as a technique of self-enhancement. Women do not do that. You might want to listen to a very interesting talk by Francis Fukuyama on the link below. He talks about how important seeking dignity and identity is throughout human history. Fukuyama is a very well-known social commentator and researcher, and his ideas of how different human societies dealt with the human need for group identity and dignity casts a very interesting light on the psychological dimension of why humans are so good in seeking self-serving attributions. The kind of attributions we make for success and failure, for example, in a university exam, can also be influenced by relatively subconscious and subtle influences such as the mood we happen to be in. In one experiment that we have published, we found that happy people are much more likely to claim credit for success, make internal and stable attributions, and reject blame for failure in an exam. People, when they are induced into negative mood, they are less likely to take credit for doing well and are more likely to blame themselves for failing. This is essentially a kind of depressogenic attributional style where we interpret the world and reality such that it is consistent with our prevailing mood. Negative mood produces more negative thoughts and our self-attributions. In this experiment, again, we found evidence that induced affective state also has an important impact on how we attribute really important events. For example, the way we explain conflicts in our relationships. What we found was that when people are non-depressed, they tend to give a positive explanation for positive events. They claim to have internal lasting causes, and they give negative events a more external explanation. They don't blame themselves or their partners. Depressed mood, on the other hand, distorts the attributional process such that people in a depressed mood interpret even positive relationship situations as due to external causes and negative events as due to internal causes. In other words, they do not take credit for things that are relatively positive, and they blame themselves more when something is negative. The way you feel, your mood, biases the kind of attributions you make. It turns out that attributional styles can also be changed by socialization and education. The kind of ideology that you get by doing certain courses at university has demonstrably changed the kind of attribution students made for different outcomes. In this study by Guimond and Palmer, 1990, they studied the attributions made by three different course students, people who studied social science, engineering, or commerce, in terms of how they explained some common negative outcomes or misadventures, for example, poverty, unemployment, or economic backwardness. As you can see, in first year, there was not very much difference between students enrolled in these three faculties. But by the time they got to their third and fourth year, they developed highly divergent attributional styles. Social science students were now much more likely to blame the system to find external attributions. Engineering students didn't change very much at all. And commerce students now blamed the individual more and the system less. In other words, what they study at university gave them a different ideological perspective in how they attributed these different sorts of social handicap. This study shows that there are important self-serving biases in attributions as a result of group membership as well. In this study, Jewish and German participants were asked to give internal or external explanations for atrocities committed by the Germans during World War II. The red column indicates external attribution and the green one internal. And as you can see, the Germans were far more likely to find external causes rather than internal causes for the atrocities. Jewish participants tended to do this much less. They were more likely to see internal causation in the atrocities committed by the Germans. So attribution errors seem to be committed by groups as well as individuals. The way we explain the causes of behavior can have very significant social and applied implications. If we explain negative events in terms of external causation, this may be helpful for coping. It's a comfort, but it also implies that the actor has less of a control and less of an ability to overcome adversity. Now, culturally, we have moved in recent decades towards providing external explanations rather than internal explanations for many adversarial negative social events. Whereas traditionally in liberal society, emphasis on individual responsibility was dominant, we increasingly tend to seek collective or group explanations, external explanations for various social problems. A good example is the question of drug abuse. A few decades ago, it used to be considered simply a crime. That implies that it's due to external causes. The person engaged in drug abuse is responsible. And it also implies that the person could potentially do something about it. If we change the definition and we now call drug dependence an illness, we use a medical model rather than a criminal model, that implies that you can't help it. Illnesses are external causes and they are beyond our control. So using the illness explanation may be comforting if you suffer from drug dependence, but it also implies that you have much less of an ability to do anything about it. A similar dichotomy exists in explaining many other negative social outcomes. For example, unemployment you can explain as due to the economic system. There is nothing you can do about it. Or you might say, maybe I'm not well enough prepared. Maybe there is some way in which I am responsible for becoming unemployed and I could improve the situation. This is particularly interesting when it comes to depression, because depression does imply a kind of helplessness, and we're going to look at how self-attributions may make a big difference in how people cope with depression. Generally, these social explanations have a possible potential of creating an ideology of victimhood, an entire narrative explanatory system in which we see individuals as not responsible for negative outcomes and finding external causes to blame. When that happens, then sometimes that kind of victim mentality might have negative consequences for people because it communicates a message that there is nothing you can do about it. By locating causation outside, you are essentially deny the possibility of the individual having causal power to change the situation. Click on the link at the bottom of the slide and have a look at that video. This slide illustrates the differences in attributional style depending on whether you attribute drug use as either an internally caused behavior, you are a substance abuser, or an externally caused behavior, you have a substance use disorder. In other words, you are ill. The study found that participants felt that a substance abuser is less likely to benefit from treatment, more likely to benefit from punishment, more likely to be socially threatening, and more likely to be blamed, but also they were more likely to control their substance abuse without help. In other words, an internal attribution is punitive, but also holds out the possibility of control. External attribution, labeling drug abuse as a disorder, is less likely to produce this kind of judgmental outcomes. This point is made very convincingly by the research of Marty Seligman, who's done a lot of research and experiments on learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is essentially a theory that seeks to explain what happens to people when they face uncontrollable outcomes and situations. Seligman argues that depression is essentially learned. We learn that our behavior is ineffectual when we experience repeated instances of not being able to change the situation. Depression occurs when people believe that failures are due to uncontrollable events, and this failure will continue as long as events are beyond your control. So depression arises out of learned helplessness. But an implication of this model is also that if your attribution for the outcome is not to external uncontrollable events, but you maintain some belief in internal mastery, then you will be in a much better position to overcome the obstacle and not become depressed. So one way to avoid depression is to continue with the attribution to some internal causation, because that implies some control. Now, the way people habitually attribute their own outcomes is also in some ways a personality trait. Some people are habitual internal attributors. They believe in the internal locus of control. And some people are more likely to find external explanations. Julian Rotter, a psychologist, created a locus of control scale which measures the tendency for people to prefer internal or external attributions. These two styles, if you like, have important consequences. As you can see, a belief in internal control is associated with better academic achievement, better interpersonal relations, greater efforts to learn, positive attitudes to exercise, lower cigarette smoking, and lower hypertension or heart attacks. External control, on the other hand, is more likely to produce a resignation to the conditions as they are, lower effort to deal with health issues, lower levels of psychological adjustment, and a belief in a non-responsive environment. Of course, blaming the outside world can also have some benefits. They produce a greater sense of satisfaction because you blame yourself less for what happens to you. So as we have seen, self-attribution is very important in everyday life because it gives us a causal explanation for what happens to us and why it happens. As we have seen before, if you adopt an external attributional strategy, it could possibly lead to a psychology of grievance and victimhood, which in the end may not be terribly helpful in giving people a tool to improve adversity. I strongly recommend that you click on the talk by Jonathan Haidt, a very well-known social psychologist at New York University, who talks in particular about the way victimhood culture might play out in a university environment. Depression and learned helplessness are a particularly interesting case where self-attribution matter. If you have a depressogenic attribution, that can be changed, for example, by cognitive behavior therapy, by training people to change their attributional style and take more of a responsibility for their outcomes. And as we have seen, temporary mood states can produce something that's very similar to a depressogenic attributional style. And we also looked at how, for example, drug dependence can be differentially explained as due to internal and external causation as an illness or a crime, and the point that internal attribution might help the capacity to cope. And the same principles might apply to other negative social outcomes, such as unemployment. So to summarize then, in this lecture, we looked at self-attribution, the elusive self. How do we know ourselves? How do we know what we feel? How do we know what we think? How do we know what we do and why we are doing it? The main message of research on self-attribution is that much of our self-knowledge is derivative, secondary. It's based on inferential processes and not on direct access to our internal workings of our mind. In other words, understanding others and understanding ourselves seem to be based on very similar inferential mechanisms, making the point that in a fundamental sense we are strangers to ourselves. We do not correctly and accurately understand our own internal processes, and quite likely we function with a biased and a distorted view of reality. It's particularly important that many of our biases are motivated. They serve the purpose of maintaining a positive self-image, overvalue the identity groups to which we belong, and devalue other groups that we often see as competitors. So self-deception is essentially a way in which we construct a reality rather than the reality itself. And once again, I suggest to look at the book The Elephant in the Brain, which is a very nice and readable description of the many ways in which human beings come to deceive themselves.